What if I told you the most important battle against the Ku Klux Klan was won, not just resisted, won, a victory so complete it was deliberately erased from history? They never told you about Captain Jim Williams. They never told you about the 600 armed, uniformed, former slaves he led on a midnight raid. And they never told you what happened when 11 terrified Klansmen heard his soldiers kick down the door. This isn't the history you were taught. This is the truth they tried to bury. Would you like me to continue with the next section, or evaluate this part based on viral script criteria? The Unseen Battle. The year is 1865. The American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in our nation's history, is finally over. 4 million Black Americans have been declared free. On paper, it's a new dawn, a moment of incredible promise. But in reality, for most of the South, freedom was just a word. Because when the Confederate Army surrendered, the war didn't truly end. It just changed. For the millions of men, women, and children stepping out of bondage, the world wasn't safe. It was a minefield. Across the former Confederacy, a new kind of terror was brewing. A shadow organization, born from the ashes of defeat, was forming in secret. They called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. Their goal was brutally simple: to restore white supremacy not through law, but through fear. And their tactics were medieval. A black man who dared to vote, his house was burned to the ground. A black leader who spoke up for his community, he was dragged from his bed and lynched. A family simply trying to buy their own land, they were whipped, brutalized, and forced back to work on the very plantations they had just escaped. In South Carolina alone, historians estimate the Klan murdered hundreds of Black Americans in just a couple of years. Local sheriffs, they looked the other way. The state courts, they refused to prosecute. For Black communities, there was nowhere to turn for protection. It was a world of crushing, overwhelming hopelessness. An unwinnable fight. But here's the part they don't teach in school. When it became clear that no one was coming to save them, some decided to save themselves. The spark of defiance. In the suffocating darkness, in this world of terror, the easiest thing to do would have been to give up, to bow your head, to stay silent, to just survive. And for a time, many tried. They appealed to the local sheriffs, who were often Klansmen themselves. They petitioned the state courts, only to have their cases thrown out by white supremacist judges. They prayed for the federal government, hundreds of miles away in Washington, to intervene. But the lynchings continued. The burnings didn't stop. And slowly a new, cold, and powerful realization began to spread. It's the realization you come to when you've knocked on every door and no one answers. It's the understanding that hits you when the very people sworn to protect you are the ones lighting the torch. It became agonizingly clear no one was coming to save them. This wasn't a call to action that was shouted from a mountaintop. It was a whisper in cabins and churches, a quiet, steely resolve that said, if we are to live, we must do this ourselves. This was the spark. It wasn't a thirst for revenge. It was a demand for justice. It wasn't a plan for an uprising. It was a plan for survival. If the law wouldn't protect their families, they would become the law, forging the sword. This wasn't a vigilante mob. This was something far more radical, far more powerful. In states like South Carolina, where Black voters had helped elect a Republican governor, they didn't just form secret self-defense groups. They did something completely legal and completely revolutionary. They organized. They formed official, state-authorized militia companies. Now, try to picture what this meant. This is just 5 years after the end of slavery. Men who had been whipped for learning to read were now being issued rifles by the state government. Men who had been legally considered property were now being given military rank, authority, and the legal power to arrest terrorists. They wore uniforms. They drilled in formation. They had the full backing of the state government. This was the ultimate threshold crossing. And they were led by incredible men, our guides on this journey. Men like Robert Smalls, a hero who had escaped slavery by commandeering a Confederate ship. Men like Prince Rivers, a born leader with a commanding presence. And in York County, a man named Captain Jim Williams, a former slave, now a state-sanctioned military commander. Think about the courage that took. To put on that uniform, to pick up that rifle, to paint a target on your back and declare, "Not on my watch." These weren't just militias. They were soldiers. They were the embodiment of a new power, a new promise. And for the first time since they were brought to America in chains, black communities had organized military power. They had forged the sword. And white supremacists, who had built their entire world on the idea of black defenselessness, absolutely lost their minds. The empire strikes back. The reaction was immediate, and it was pure, unadulterated terror. Southern newspapers went into a complete panic. They published grotesque cartoons, depicting these new black soldiers as savage apes with guns. Headlines screamed about Negro rule and race war, warning white families that the militias were planning to massacre them in their sleep. The very idea of armed, organized black men shattered the entire foundation of white supremacy. And the Klan didn't just write articles. They escalated. Their violence, once directed at the defenseless, now became a targeted campaign of assassination against these new leaders. To be a member of the militia, to be like Jim Williams, was to volunteer for a death sentence. The Klan was sending a brutal message. How dare you? The stakes were now, quite literally, life and death. The heroes, by taking their first steps, had painted a massive target on their own backs. But something else was happening. Word of this lawless terror reached Washington, D.C., and it landed on the desk of a man who understood war. President Ulysses S. Grant, to his credit, saw this for what it was. He had just fought a war to end slavery, and he was not about to let ex-Confederates terrorize their way back into power. In 1S71, he did something unprecedented. He asked Congress to pass what became known as the Ku Klux Klan Act, giving him the power to suspend habeas corpus and deploy federal troops to fight domestic terrorists. An ally, a powerful ally. But in South Carolina, the lynchings were happening now. The federal troops were still hundreds of miles away. For Captain Jim Williams, watching his neighbors terrorized and a fellow militiaman lynched as a warning, the time for waiting was over. He had the law on his side. He had the men. And he had had enough. Midnight in South Carolina. October 1871. York County, South Carolina. The tension has hit a breaking point. A black militiaman has been lynched by the Klan, his body left as a grotesque warning. The message is clear. Join the militia and die. Most white officials expect the black community to back down, to be terrified, to accept that resistance is futile. But they have profoundly misunderstood Captain Jim Williams. He's watched his neighbors terrorized for years. He's seen the children orphaned, the women widowed. He's listened to every empty promise and every pathetic excuse. He is done waiting for permission to defend his people. That night, Williams musters his company. This isn't a small band. It's 600 men. They begin a night march that will become a legend in black communities, even as it is systematically erased from white memory. Imagine it. 600 men moving through the darkness with military precision. No torches, no shouting, just the sound of boots on dirt roads. Their target, the plantation, a known, high-ranking Klan leader, a man who has openly boasted about his role in multiple lynchings. When they arrive, Williams doesn't just charge in. He's a commander. He's a tactician. He positions his men, in a complete perimeter around the house. There is no escape, no way out. Then they move. The doors fly apart. And in an instant, the entire power dynamic of the South is turned upside down. Klansmen who had spent years terrorizing defenseless families suddenly find themselves staring down the barrels of rifles. Rifles held by black soldiers. Soldiers who have every legal right to be there. Williams and his men arrest 11 Klansmen that night. They drag them out in their night clothes, bind their hands, and march them to federal custody. And here is the most powerful detail of all. Not a single shot is fired. The entire operation is executed with breathtaking discipline. This wasn't a mob seeking revenge. This was an army. This was justice. And that is exactly what terrified them. The victory. That sound, the sound of Captain Williams's boot kicking in that door, was the sound of a new era. Word of the York County raid spread like wildfire. It was a bolt of electricity through South Carolina's black communities. If it worked there, it could work everywhere. And it did. Within weeks, black militia captains across the state were conducting similar discipline operations. In Union County, a black officer and his men arrested an entire Klan den, 19 terrorists captured in a single coordinated raid. In Spartanburg, known Klansmen started fleeing to North Carolina, terrified that the militias would come for them next. The results were not small. They were stunning. In counties where black militia companies actively patrolled, Klan violence didn't just decrease. It nearly vanished. Historians and federal reports in the time show a 90% drop in terrorist attacks wherever these black soldiers operated. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a political negotiation. This is what happens when oppressed communities are finally given the tools, the authority, and the organization to defend themselves. Federal prosecutors, backed by President Grant's KKK Act, moved quickly to capitalize on this momentum. By late 1871, they had arrested over 600 Klansmen in South Carolina alone. And who do you think was the star witness in these federal trials? Black militiamen. Imagine the scene. Black men, men who just years before were forbidden from even making eye contact with a white man, were now taking the witness stand, their heads held high. They looked their former masters and tormentors in the eye, and they testified. They named names. They described the crimes. They provided the evidence that led to convictions. The Klan's entire aura of invincibility, the hoods, the darkness, the fear, it all shattered. The original Ku Klux Klan, the one founded by Confederate veterans, was broken. It was defeated. It was crushed. It's one of the greatest, most profound triumphs of justice in American history. A victory won by the courage, the discipline, and the organization of the very people they tried to terrorize. This should be a national holiday. This should be a story we tell every child. But that's not what happened. The great betrayal. Because as it turns out, the victory was too successful. White America was watching all of this unfold, and the reality of it made many of them deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. It was one thing to support freedom and voting rights as abstract concepts. It was another thing entirely to see newspaper illustrations of armed black soldiers arresting white men. It was another thing to read accounts of black captains interrogating Confederate veterans. They were realizing that armed, organized, and victorious black communities didn't just mean the end of Klan. It meant a fundamental shift in power. And many of them, North and South, just weren't ready for that. So the support had just evaporated. Northern industrialists worried about labor unrest. Northern politicians saw a chance to reclaim Southern votes by making a new compromise with white supremacy. The federal troops, who had been the militia's crucial allies, were quietly withdrawn. Funding for the militia operations dried up, and into that vacuum, The old powers returned with a vengeance. White supremacist redeemer governments began winning elections, using the very fraud and violence the militias had almost stamped out. And what was their very first order of business? They moved against the black militias with vicious legal efficiency. The weapons were confiscated. The companies were disbanded. Black officers were arrested on trumped-up charges of insurrection and inciting a riot. The very same men who had stopped the riots, who had enforced the law, were now being branded as criminals. And then came the final brutal message. Captain Jim Williams, the man who proved it could be done, the hero who led the 600. He was murdered by white supremacists in 1872. His killers were never prosecuted. They never faced a trial. They walked free, protected by the very same legal system that Williams had used to arrest Klansmen just months before. It was a lynching, pure and simple. And it sent a message to every black leader in the South. This is what happens when you win. The truth we were never told. And then came the final insult, the one that would last for over 150 years. Historians, the very people tasked with remembering, erased the entire story. The textbooks were rewritten. Children were taught that Reconstruction failed because black people were unprepared for freedom or too ignorant to govern. They were taught that the period descended into chaos, conveniently ignoring that it was the black militias who had actually brought order by defeating the terrorists. For a century, American students learned that the KKK was an invincible, unstoppable boogeyman, that black communities were helpless, passive victims. It is a complete, deliberate, and vicious inversion of the truth. Here is a revelation that changes everything. The original Ku Klux Klan didn't just fade away. It was militarily destroyed by organized, disciplined, and courageous black soldiers. They were beaten. They were crushed. They were defeated by the very people they tried to terrorize. And that is why the story had to be buried. Because a story of victory is not a tragedy. A story of victory is a blueprint. It proves something that white supremacy could never, ever tolerate. When black communities have resources, organization, and the means to defend themselves, they don't just survive racist violence. They defeat it. The second Ku Klux Klan, the one that marched on Washington in 1915 with millions of members, could only exist because the heroes of 1871 had been disarmed. The lynchings of the Jim Crow era could only happen in communities that had been legally stripped of their power to fight back. So the next time someone tells you that progress is only given by permission, remember Captain Jim Williams. Remember 600 soldiers marching through the darkness. Remember the 90% drop in violence. Remember that for one brief, shining, forgotten moment, black military organization crushed white supremacist terror so thoroughly that it took a century of deliberate forgetting to hide the truth. Their names were erased. Their achievements were buried. But their victory was real. It happened. It worked. And that is the history they never wanted you to know.